How do revolutions actually work? This is the question Crane Brinton tries to answer in The Anatomy of Revolution. Brinton writes about the stages a society progresses through, from pre-revolutionary tension through a revolution to the aftermath. An Anatomy of Revolution was Crane Brinton's most influential work. As a professor of history at Harvard University, Brinton produced over a dozen major works. Brinton also contributed to the U.S. war effort in the Second World War. While he was too old to serve in the military, Brinton worked with the Office of Strategic Services in London, contributing to Allied intelligence efforts. In The Anatomy of Revolution, Crane Brinton examines four revolutions: the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Russian Revolution. The first thing Crane Brinton points out is that no society is totally free of crime, criticism of the ruling class, or occasional disturbances such as protests, strikes, or cases of attacks on civil liberties. A healthy society will have a manageable number of social ills. It's when tensions become much more intense than normal that society can become revolutionary. If you like this type of content, like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you think Britain got revolutions right, and if a revolution would happen this way in your country. Back to the video. When the revolutions take place, it isn't because the economic situation has become dire. On the contrary, the overall economic situation in the countries studied by Brinton were going well, and were on an upswing in many countries prior to the revolution. There were portions of the population who were not doing well, but they were not the instigators of the revolutions. Despite the overall economic well-being, the governments of these countries were chronically short of money. New forms of taxes were being levied on the middle and merchant classes in these countries. The new taxes often made the middle and merchant classes feel that they were unable to fulfill their dreams and goals. In England, James I and his son Charles I were modernizing the government by starting to provide basic social services, maintaining a professional army and navy, and relying on a professional class of civil servants. All these modernizations required regular payments of cash. The English tax system was still based on medieval policies, which made tax collection contentious and irregular, adding to the middle and merchant classes' frustrations. In the American colonies, additional taxes after the 7 Years' War, as well as closing off part of the frontier to potential colonists, caused American colonists to feel that economic opportunities were being taken away from them. In France, the bureaucracy, that had been building up since the Middle Ages, had become very inefficient, making it hard for French citizens to be able to get anything done. And in Russia, the First World War put a stop to steady economic progress the country had been making in the decades before the war. Frustration at economic policies by itself isn't enough to make the middle and merchant classes start to consider revolution. The middle and merchant classes must feel that the curves on their ability to run businesses and make money is an intrusion on their fundamental rights. Pressure groups in society are a prerequisite to a revolution. All societies have pressure groups in them. Pressure groups are groups that agitate or lobby for a particular cause. This could be a group trying to stop a billboard from going up in their neighborhood, or to get their water system replaced, to more nationwide causes such as the abortion issue, or a trade group trying to get their taxes lowered. The existence of pressure groups in society does not mean that revolution is in the air, but pressure groups can become an important part of the process of society becoming revolutionary. Pressure groups go through a few stages to become revolutionary. First, they organize themselves to take direct and sometimes aggressive action for their cause. Although a few pressure groups may organize directly for revolution, most just feel that their issue is not getting the attention it needs given its seriousness. After some time of being ignored and their members feeling that their economic futures are at risk as a result, pressure groups will sometimes start to plan for direct action or to remove the nation's current leadership. The transfer of the allegiance of the intellectuals happens in almost all societies before a revolution. Intellectuals in this context means writers, artists, musicians, actors, teachers, and preachers. In every age, there are intellectuals that complain about the current state of affairs, and a few that want to change the way society is organized altogether. But most intellectuals, most of the time, don't want to radically change things, even if they have issues with certain aspects of the political or economic system. In a revolutionary society, many, if not most, intellectuals are displeased with the current situation, and they want the system changed. Often, when large numbers of intellectuals are displeased with the current situation, they don't have a vision of what should come next. There may be subgroups of intellectuals that know what they want, but the rest of the intellectuals will disagree or have no idea what they want next. When intellectuals are in disagreement, they are unable to provide the intellectual framework needed for a revolution. When the intellectuals are mostly in agreement of what should come after the current government, they are a revolutionary threat. Intellectuals can produce the writings, art, and a moral framework needed to shape a revolution. For intellectuals to shift their allegiance to a new system, the new system must be contrasted with the old system. The new system must be seen to be fairer and better than the old system. The next characteristic of a revolutionary society is the intensification of class tensions. Britain doesn't just mean class in the Marxian sense of the bourgeois versus the proletariat, but more broadly, as groups that are in the ruling class and those that are not. This could primarily be an economic division, or it could be based on culture, religion, or some other division, or a combination of divisions. The ruling class isn't just the class that makes important political and economic decisions, but also set culture, such as literature, fashion, and art. Those in the ruling class vary and are different in each society, but will include some of the following: the politicians, the important civil servants, the bankers, the men of affairs. This usually refers to important and influential business people, the great landowning nobles, the officers of the armed forces, the priesthood, and some of the intellectuals. In a non-revolutionary society, people from the middle and lower classes accept the rule of the ruling class, sometimes seeing it as divinely ordained and aspiring to join. In revolutionary societies, the ruling class is seen by the middle and lower classes, according to Brinton, as unnatural and unjust privileges, established by wicked men against the express intention of Almighty God, nature, or science. Ruling classes that are able to stay in power tend to exhibit certain traits. First, they do not shrink from using force to maintain their rule. They do not value wit or originality too highly in their members. There is respect for established ways of thinking and behaving. An ability to compromise is important, as is the ability to innovate when necessary. A healthy ruling class will also recruit gifted and ambitious members of the lower and middle classes. One of the ways the ruling class becomes unhealthy as society edges toward revolution is by losing faith in their right to hold the position they are in. Many in the ruling class will believe that they hold power unjustly, or that all men are equal. Sometimes members of the ruling class will believe that the beliefs and values they were brought up on were silly. Members of the ruling class may simply come to the realization that they cannot win a struggle to stay in their position, so they might as well join the winning side. As the ruling class loses control of society, their ability to use force, when necessary, becomes sporadic and inefficient. At the same time, the ruling class loses its ability to use force. Members of the ruling class that reject the traditional hierarchy become more numerous and conspicuous, setting the tone for the ruling and upper classes, as well as for much of society. The ruling class usually becomes disillusioned with their own position in society when their economic situation starts to decline. In England, as the standard of living was rising, many aristocrats were unable to keep up. In France, the cost of living was rising, but the amount of wealth members of the ruling class could collect didn't keep up. The vanishing fortunes of the ruling class doesn't give them much incentive to keep supporting the status quo. Often in a revolutionary society, it is more difficult for the lower classes to move up into the ruling class than it had been in the past. In France, for example, many people in the lower classes were able to move into the ruling class through excelling in business, science, or the arts. Many were able to be officially raised into nobility. In the decades before the revolution, France was making it difficult to ascend to the higher classes. The king was also revoking documents of nobility people had earned or bought to then resell them to raise money. This hardening of class divisions is a major source of resentment of the lower classes toward the ruling class. Before a revolution, class tensions become much worse than normal. Class tensions are impossible to quantify and require a deep knowledge and feel for a society to read the subtle signs that tensions are increasing under the surface. The tipping point into revolution isn't obvious to anyone, even those who are agitating for revolution or regime change. There are always many events that lead up to a revolution. For example, in the English Revolution, there were many events before violence broke out that could be argued to be the point where the revolution became inevitable. First was the dissolution of Parliament. Second was the reconvening of Parliament. Next, Parliament voted for the Grand Remonstrance. The king responded by trying to arrest 6 members of Parliament, who were able to escape. The 6 members of Parliament that escaped were able to take control of the army, and the English Civil War had begun. Any one of these events, or many others that I didn't list, could be argued to have made the English Civil War inevitable. There are 2 similarities in the revolution studied by Brinton. First, The revolutions are the result of the government's financial problems. The government usually tries to solve this by raising taxes that disrupt the merchant and middle class's ascent into wealth. Second, there is a short period of calm after the initial beginning of the revolution. It appears that the revolutionaries have quickly won. Unfortunately, this calm doesn't last long, as there is usually a civil war as the old regime tries to regain their power. The question that is often asked when people are learning about revolutions is how much was the beginning of the revolution planned versus was the revolution a spontaneous uprising? The reality is that it is a bit of both. People who are against a revolution will usually describe the revolution as the result of a small group of determined malcontents and professional agitators that didn't really have the backing of the majority of the public. Before a revolution, there are always groups agitating for a change in government, or at least major changes in policy. Many of these groups agitating for a change don't know about each other, but when they sense that the people are outraged at the government, many will try to stir up crowds. Most of these groups don't work together, and none of them have specific plans for what to do during a revolution. So revolutions are planned in that there are organized groups agitating for revolution, but when that opportunity comes, they are reacting to the opportunity more than they are carrying out any plans. One of the main similarities of all the revolutions studied is the failure of the old regimes to use force at the beginning of the revolution. The 4 revolutions studied by Brinton would have been nipped in the bud if the governments being overthrown had been able to apply force effectively when the revolution was getting started. In the English Revolution, the king had a loyal but small officer corps, which was unable to match the large amount of manpower the parliament was able to muster. During the Russian Revolution, Cossacks were sent to put down the bread riots in St. Petersburg, but took the side of the people in the streets instead. The inability of the ruling class to effectively use force to put down a revolution has much to do with the breakdown of the ruling class's ability to rule effectively, as it does with anything the revolutionaries were doing. If you remember, we listed the traits of a healthy ruling class earlier. When the ruling class is unable to maintain those healthy traits, it can affect military and police forces' effectiveness and morale. In the years during the breakdown of the ruling class, before the eventual start of the revolution, discipline in the military is often eroded away. Poor treatment and pay of the rank-and-file soldiers often makes them sympathetic to the civilians' plight. As conditions for soldiers get worse, united command structures often break down, soldiers lose confidence, and they lose any desire to take action for their government and superiors. The failure of the use of force to put down the revolution is extremely important to the success of the revolution. Almost every successful revolution came after the government lost control of the use of force, or at least the loss of the ability to effectively use force. The loss of the ability to use force is usually because the military or police are unwilling to use force against the revolutionaries, or because the military or police join the revolutionaries. In some rare occasions, an outside nation can interfere with the government's ability to deploy force against revolutionaries. In all 4 of the revolutions studied, the government falls quickly, without massive bloodshed. For a short time, there is a honeymoon period where it seems that the revolution is over, and most people believe that a prosperous and peaceful future has been achieved. The honeymoon period is different for each revolution, but does not last long in any of them. There isn't a single type of revolutionary. People that were unethical and criminal were revolutionaries, as were honest, upright members of their community. There are more middle-class and wealthy people who become revolutionaries, but people from all parts of the social economic spectrum become revolutionaries. It is possible to make some generalizations about who is likely to become a revolutionary, but it is nuanced, and there are always numerous exceptions. Getting the breakdown of the rank and file of the 4 revolutions Brinton examines is difficult. The governments during the time of these revolutions were not keeping good records on their populations. The best records come from the French Revolution. Brinton was able to take the names of surviving local Jacobin clubs records and cross-reference them with local tax data to get a breakdown of the social economic status of Jacobin clubs before and during the revolution. The Jacobin clubs were where much of the revolutionary action happened. At the beginning of the revolution, the clubs that we have records for showed the middle class making up 62%, the working class making up 28%, and peasants making up 10%. The average age was between 38 and 45. The initial period after the fall of the government, the middle class was 66%, the working class was 26%, and the peasants were 8%. When the revolution fell into its violent period, the middle class made up 57%, the working class made up 32%, and the peasants were 11%. The other 3 revolutions don't have very good records. For the American Revolution, there were comments from the time that described the supporters of the revolution as shabby. In this case, it is difficult to tell how accurate this statement is, since many of the people making these comments were probably supporters of the crown and hence were biased. Based on the records of the French Revolution and some clues about the other revolutions, it seems that the rank and file of the revolutions were made up of the middle and working classes primary. There were few high-born nobles or people from the poorest part of society. The societal economic makeup of the local leadership of the revolutions was about the same as the rank and file. At a higher level of leadership, there were people of different backgrounds, but most were from middle-class and upper-class backgrounds. Most had higher levels of formal education, including many scientists, lawyers, bureaucrats, merchants, and other professionals. Some were from the lower classes and had self-educated themselves enough to get a professional job or become a successful business person. Most revolutionaries in high leadership roles were in their 30s and 40s, although there were people younger and older. Interestingly, the most radical revolutionaries were often the oldest revolutionaries. Revolutionaries come from different backgrounds and become revolutionaries for different reasons. Brinton uses the term gentleman revolutionary for revolutionaries from the ruling class. There seems to be two reasons someone from the ruling class would join or help instigate a revolution. One is because the gentleman revolutionary doesn't feel at home in the ruling class. This may be because the gentleman revolutionary hasn't achieved the type of things that are expected of someone in their position and are looked down on or ignored by others in the ruling class. In the modern context, this may be not getting into a prestigious university despite going to the best schools, or running companies into the ground, although this doesn't seem to have been a barrier to the ruling class for quite some time. Some of the ruling class see their class and the things that are done to keep their position in society as cruel and heartless. Often, people who join revolutions from the ruling class see replacing the current system as a way to a better future for everyone. Some from the ruling class have more selfish reasons for joining a revolution. Often, some from the ruling class think that the revolutionaries are going to win, and so join the revolution in an attempt to preserve their position and wealth. Sometimes it's just seen as fashionable to join the revolution. Some of the ruling class may see it as a way to seem cool, often not realizing what would happen if they were part of a revolution that failed, or what would happen to their position in society if the revolution succeeded. The people from the middle and lower classes who become leaders of a revolution are often people who have been unable to fulfill their ambitions to rise to a higher station in life. They are sometimes people from the middle class who receive a good education but are unable to rise into the ruling class. Sometimes these are people from the lower classes who are able to educate themselves but are not taken seriously by those in positions of power and influence. Before a revolution, the normal upward rise of those with intelligence and ambition is shut down, and no one is able to ascend to higher positions in life, no matter how smart they are or how hard they work. Sometimes people who want violence or are quick to violence when they don't get their way become leaders of a revolution. The leaders who are especially violent sometimes get away with it, but often after the revolution has calmed down, these violent leaders are punished, exiled, or killed. After the revolution is over, those that were wronged and people who lost friends or family to the violence perpetrated by the violent leader are often able to get justice. An important type of revolutionary, possibly the most important type, is the idealist. In non-revolutionary societies, idealists and their ideals are seen as strange or silly, and often both. They and their ideas are kept on the fringes of society. During a revolution, the idealists are often the ones that are most likely to work the hardest and take leadership positions. A revolution is a chance for the idealists to enact their ideas and destroy the system that has kept them and their ideas on the sidelines. Brinton paraphrases Eric Hoffer to explain that a revolution first has the theory of a different system developed by intellectuals who have transferred their allegiance. Then that theory is implemented by fanatics. And finally, the revolution is tamed by practical men of action who turn the revolution and its ideas into the status quo. These men of action are people such as Cromwell in the English Revolution or Stalin for the Russian Revolution. The moderates take over as the new government after the initial success of the revolution. The moderates represent revolutionaries that are wealthier, better known, and better connected. The wealth, notoriety, and many connections of the moderates make it easier for them to take over the government. Although the moderates are moderate in the context of the revolutionaries, many people in society would consider the moderates of the revolution to be quite radical, especially the conservatives who defended the old government. There are problems with the moderates. First, they don't have very good party discipline. The radical wings of the revolution were often active before the revolution started, and so had to be disciplined to stay under the radar of the authorities. Radical groups developed internal structures to keep discipline in their group. Another issue the moderates are faced with is the many tasks they must take on simultaneously when they assume power. The moderates must reform the government, do the day-to-day governing, and often fight a foreign or civil war, sometimes both. A major issue the moderates face is attacks from the more radical wings of the revolution. Radical and fringe groups start accusing the moderates of wanting to stop the revolution, of betraying the revolution, and that they are as bad or worse than the old rulers. The radicals are then able to overthrow the moderates and take power. After the moderates are kicked out, the radical groups often split into less radical and more radical groups and fight amongst themselves for power. In all of the revolutions Brinton studied, the moderates took power initially, but were ultimately pushed out by more radical groups. In the English Revolution and Civil War, the Presbyterians took control after the Royalists were defeated. The Presbyterians still wanted a king. They just wanted to make sure that the king was unable to exceed the boundaries of his power again. Unfortunately for the Presbyterians, the power of the revolution lay with Cromwell and his New Model Army. The New Model Army was made up of independents, which included Baptists, Anabaptists, and other smaller denominations. The independents believed that the government should stay out of people's religious beliefs and consider them a private matter. The tolerance preached by the independents only extended to certain denominations. Some denominations, mainly Catholics, but also a few others, were to be excluded from English society. The extremists in the New Model Army and their political allies wanted to get rid of the king and moved to exclude the leaders of the Presbyterians from the new government. The Presbyterians formed their own army to fight back, but were defeated at Preston Pans, making Cromwell and his New Model Army the only power left in Britain, putting them in total control. In France, the moderates took over after the storming of the Bastille and the October days when the king and queen were brought back to Paris from Versailles in 1789. Moderates like Lafayette didn't want to get rid of King, but wanted to dilute his power with an assembly of some sort. Some were the moderates looked at England's bicameral system of a House of Lords and a House of Commons for inspiration. In 1792, war broke out with Austria and Prussia. Many in France suspected the king of treason, and the radicals, also known as the Republicans, were able to overthrow the new government when they attacked Tuileries Palace. The radicals got rid of the monarchy and made France a republic. The more moderate wing of the radicals, the Girondins, wanted to stop the revolution after the overthrow of the monarchy. The Girondins didn't want to execute the king and wanted power in the new republic to be in the hands of the government and wealthy individuals. The Mountain were the more radical side of the Republicans, represented by people like Robespierre, often advocating for the urban poor. The Mountain went ahead with the execution of the king in January of 1793. The Girondins lost control of the Jacobin clubs, and the Mountain was able to take control of the country. In Russia, after the Tsar abdicated in 1917, the Cadets became the majority in the Duma. The best comparison for the Cadets today would be to think of them as left-of-center Democrats. There was some representation of right-wing parties and one socialist, Kerensky, in the Duma. The new government broke down after 2 months because they couldn't agree on whether to continue with the war or stop it. After the breakdown of the new government, Kerensky became the leader of the government, and many positions were given to Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, both of whom were moderates compared to the Bolsheviks. The new members of the government didn't trust the Cadets and pushed them out. The new government continued to pursue the war and wanted to bring about social reform through the legislative process instead of a dictatorship of the proletariat. The Bolsheviks then labeled the new members of the government as compromisist. The Bolsheviks staged an uprising in Petrograd, which failed, forcing Lenin into hiding and getting Trotsky thrown in jail. Trotsky was released from jail a little while later and became the leader of the Petrograd Soviet. From there, Lenin, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks launched another uprising, but this time they had recruited most of the local military personnel to their side, and so the uprising was successful, with almost no fighting. The uprising in Moscow took about a week, but after taking Moscow, Kerensky fled, and the Bolsheviks were in control of Russia. One of the steps the radicals used to wrestle power away from the moderates is a period of dual sovereignty. For a time before the radicals ultimately take control, The official government, made up of moderates and the organizations controlled by the radicals, both act as separate governments, each issuing rules and laws that they separately enforce. This makes life confusing and difficult for average people, as some of the rules issued by the different governments conflict. Dual sovereignty should not be confused with resistance to a law. When a country is in a state of dual sovereignty, both the official government and an unofficial radical government are creating and enforcing laws. Resistance to a law means that a particular law or set of laws is not being enforced or is being ignored. If the unofficial radical government were resisting laws, they would just ignore them, like how people often ignore speed limits. In a dual sovereignty situation, the unofficial radical government would be setting and enforcing their own speed limits. A major difficulty the moderates face when trying to deal with the radicals' illegal dual sovereignty is the fact that they have inherited the institutions that made the last government unpopular, and many will see the new government in a similar light. When moderates take over the government, they very quickly face opposition from more radical groups in the revolution. The moderates have three options when faced with opposition from the radicals. First, they can try to suppress the radicals' illegal government. Second, they can try to take control of the radicals' government. And lastly, they can just ignore the radicals. Often the moderates try to do a bit of everything, which has always ended up being ineffective. For example, during the Russian Revolution, when the moderates were in charge of the new government, they tried to suppress newspapers that were aligned with the Bolsheviks, but the suppression backfired, since the Bolsheviks would accuse the moderates of using the tactics of the old regime. During the French Revolution, the moderates created the Feuillants Society to try to replace the Jacobin clubs that supported the radicals. The Feuillants Society was an attempt to take control of the revolutionary feelings supporting the radicals, but failed. In the revolutionary environment, moderates are unable to match the radicals' appeal. The moderates will try to take support away from the radicals, but the radicals are always able to maintain their support. The moderates, unable to convince people to switch their support from the radicals to themselves, will then try to appeal to the conservatives. Appealing to the conservatives totally delegitimizes the moderates, since the conservatives were against the revolution in the first place. Many of the conservatives by this time had fled the country, been executed, or don't trust the people who just overthrow the last government that they had supported. After this turn to the conservatives, it is easy for the radicals to get support from many facets of society and overthrow the moderates. Another major weakness of the moderates is the fact that most of the soldiers in the revolutions fighting the old regime are radicals. This was very evident in the English Revolution, when the most effective, dedicated, and experienced soldiers for the parliamentary cause was the New Model Army. The New Model Army was made up mostly of independents who supported the most radical groups. When the moderates first take control of the government after the overthrow of the old regime, the revolutionary groups, like the Jacobin clubs or the Soviets, are made up of people with a variety of moderate and radical viewpoints. The extremists are able to take control of the revolutionary groups by driving out anybody that doesn't agree with their viewpoint. When the moderates are expelled from the revolutionary groups, the radicals use the new, more ideologically homogeneous revolutionary groups as the basis for a second government that exerts authority in the same area as the official government, creating a condition of dual sovereignty. The revolutionary groups are usually more disciplined than the official government. The discipline of the revolutionary groups is the result of being suppressed by the old regime, making discipline and secrecy essential for survival. The discipline of the revolutionary groups makes them efficient as second governments, and in taking control of the country from the moderates. After purging moderates from revolutionary groups such as the Jacobins in France or the Soviets in Russia, the revolutionary groups are much smaller. Even though their numbers are small, they are very devoted to their cause and are usually much more willing to sacrifice to get what they believe in. One of the main justifications given by the extremists as to why they should take over and control things when they are a small minority of the population is that they are a trustee that will bring the country into a better new system. The extremists tend to get more popular compared to the moderates as the revolution continues. The extremists don't really get more popular, but many people that supported the moderates weren't deeply devoted, and so they stopped actively participating in politics or paying attention. The extremist supporters are, by contrast, very devoted to their cause, so their support stays steady as the moderate support drops over time. Extremists will also try to create havoc in the election process by beating up moderates, harassing moderate candidates, and using other similar tactics to try to win elections so they can claim that they represent the people. When the extremists are unable to prevail at the ballot box, they will try to discredit the election or the winning candidates, or use other means to take control. One of the strengths of having small numbers is that the extremists can change course very quickly. They can get people out to help win an election, and if that doesn't work out, they can quickly change course and try something else to take power. In large organizations, changing course takes much more time because you must inform a large number of people and make sure everybody is on the same page. In small organizations, these things can be done much more quickly. Another advantage of having a small, devoted group of people is that they follow their leaders much more faithfully, making it easier to get things done as a group. The members of these organizations are devoted to the cause and see following their leaders as the way to bring about the new world they want. Many people would see the leaders of these revolutions as hypocrites, since they preach that their leadership will bring about a new and better order for everybody. The independents in the English Revolution believed that they would bring about a nation closer to God. The Jacobins believed they would bring liberty to France, and the Bolsheviks believed they would guide Russia and the world to a classless society. The leaders of these movements fought, imprisoned, and killed many people despite their universal ideals and their belief that they were creating a better future for everybody. In the eyes of the leaders of these revolutions, everything they were doing was to further the goal of a better future. Even Robespierre, who before the French Revolution argued for the abolishment of the death penalty, didn't believe that he was betraying his own beliefs because the cause of the revolution was too important. When the extremists take over the government, they are able to hit the ground running. Extremists are often able to control some aspects of society while the moderates take control of the government. During the Russian Revolution, for example, the Bolsheviks were able to gain control of many Soviets. In all the revolutions Brinton studies, the extremists take control of some parts of the government or society before fully taking over the government. Members of the extremist groups would take over much of the media and other important industries. The experience of administrating large areas of society gives the extremists the skills necessary to make a relatively smooth transition from moderate to extremist governments. The period the extremists control parts of the government or society is the dual sovereignty period. During this time, the extremists are often issuing laws and rules that conflict with what the moderate government is trying to do. One of the first things revolutionaries do is shut down many freedoms they use to overthrow the government. Freedoms like the freedom of the press and freedom of assembly are often suppressed. After the independents took control of England, what freedom of religion people had was severely curtailed for denominations the Puritans didn't like, such as the Anglican and Presbyterian churches. The new government doesn't want someone else to do to them what they were able to do to the last government. The new government's most common justification for cracking down on freedoms is that they must stop people from going back to their old ways. Once the extremists take control, a figurehead for the new government is established. The exact title varies depending on which revolution and what stage of the revolution is in. Examples of the figurehead would be Cromwell, Robespierre, or Lenin. Despite the high profile of the figureheads, the main decision-making and formulating of new policy is done with committees. The new governments, despite their experience during the dual sovereignty period, are run inefficiently. Many in the new government are appointed based on loyalty to the new government and not on competence or experience. Because most of the appointees don't have experience being administrators, they are usually incompetent. The administration of the new government is very ineffective and inefficient. Despite the inexperience and incompetence, the new administrators have intense pressure from their superiors to get their department, district, or province economically productive again, and to keep any challenges to the new government at bay. The pressure from above and the inefficient administration often leads to violent and repressive rule. Brute force and fear replace clever and efficient administration. An interesting phenomenon that seems to happen in all the revolutions studied in this book is that common crime nearly stops. It's unclear why this happens, but there are two probably causes. First, after the extremists take control of the government, there is often a general crusade against vice. Known criminals such as thieves and prostitutes are often grabbed off the streets and held, or even lynched then and there. The crusade against vice is often carried out haphazardly, so many criminals don't get caught or even have somebody come after them. The criminals that aren't in danger still rarely commit any crimes during this period. These criminals, like the rest of the population during this period, are just trying to keep a low profile and waiting to see what happens next. The crisis period is the violent period after the extremists take control of the government. The terror is the violence and atmosphere of fear during the crisis period. As I mentioned before, the terror happens because of the inexperience and incompetence of many of the new administrators. The terror is the most intrusive part of the revolution for ordinary people. Up to this point, the average non-political person wouldn't have been directly affected by the revolution, unless they had the unfortunate luck to have their village or town be the site of a battle or used by one side or the other as a base of operation. Once the extremists take control and no longer have to contend with the moderates, they face the task of administering the whole country. Many at the top of the new government have experience in administration gained while being a leader in the revolutionary group before the revolution and during period of dual sovereignty. But most of the mid and lower level administrative appointees will have little or no administrative experience. Because the mid and lower level administrative appointees don't know what they are doing, they often result to bullying and violence to get the results they need. Often the new government will recognize or reward regular people for going after supporters of the previous government, creating an environment of vigilantism. The new government and its supporters do many things that make life for the ordinary, non-political resident stressful. One of the first things the government does is rename many things in society, from physical places to introducing new names and, as happened in the French Revolution, create a completely new calendar. These name changes can be annoying, as many places and streets now have different official names. For example, after the French Revolution, Place Louis XV became Place de la Révolution. In Puritan England, after the Revolution, names like Praise God Barebone and Put Thy Trust in Christ and Flee Fornication Williams were common. There were many examples like these in all four of the revolutions studied. The revolutionary government also creates many new holidays and celebrations to celebrate their ascension to power. The revolutionary government often replaces more traditional religious and nationalistic holidays with their own, as well as adding new ones. For an ordinary resident, this may be stressful and annoying, since they may have looked forward to these holidays. The sheer number of new holidays that an ordinary citizen would feel obliged to celebrate so as not to arouse any suspicion of disloyalty can be exhausting. The members of the revolutionary government at this stage often have a very idealistic view of how human society can be run and cleansed of immoral behavior. The idealism of the new government appointees results in the government going after and stopping things like drinking, gambling, prostitution, and laziness. Many members of the public indulge in one or more of these activities and can be stressed when these activities are no longer available. Another victim of the revolutionary government's idealism is privacy. The new government, in its attempt to enforce good behavior, often turns many members of the public into informants and responses to rumors and gossip. This creates a feeling of fear for ordinary members of the public, as a false rumor could cause problems with the government. All these inconveniences and stresses make normal members of the public ready for anybody that can stop the day-to-day stress they now feel. To the devoted revolutionary, the devotion to the revolution and its ideals is similar to a religious fanatic. That isn't to say that economic motivations don't play an important role, or that economic motivations aren't the primary cause of the revolution, but that a revolutionary's devotion to the rebellion's ideas, economic or otherwise, is like that to a deeply religious person's devotion to their religion. The revolutionaries develop rituals and organize themselves like a religious organization and are always trying to convince or convert people to their way of thinking. In all four of the revolutions studied, the new government tries to imprint order, discipline, and contempt for vice on the populace, similar to the goals of many religious institutions and movements. The problem with trying to instill discipline, order, and contempt for vice in areas of common life where people aren't used to it is that it takes a long time for those traits to become a normal part of people's lives. Part of the terror is a reaction from the extremists when they are unable to convince regular people to live by their strict moral principles. One of the main characteristics of all the revolutionaries is the belief that the revolution was inevitable. For the Calvinists in the English Revolution, God made the revolution inevitable, while the French revolutionists believed that logic and reason dictated that the French Revolution was inevitable. In Russia, Marx's ideas of dialectic materialism made the establishment of a proletariat state only a matter of time. Once the revolution has happened, the revolutionaries adopt a type of nationalism for the new political order. The new nationalism was inward-focused and wasn't concerned with spreading their ideas abroad. Though much of the violence of the terror was the result of incompetent administration and the general population's less than enthusiastic reception to new ideas and the suppression of vice, much of the justification of the terror is the result of sincerely held beliefs among the extremists that they hold the one true way of politics. This belief makes many extremist revolutionaries feel justified in eliminating anyone who opposes them or their ideas. The new governments and their leaders developed rituals, symbols, and saints, similar to how various religions have rituals, symbols, and saints. The leaders of the French Revolution borrowed from Catholic, Protestant, and classical rituals to create rituals to the idea of the Republic. All the revolutions studied in this book created and borrowed rituals in order to create their own ritualistic systems. The Bolsheviks created a unique style of posters and artwork to symbolize the revolution, as well as make Lenin into a secular saint-like figure. After the crisis period and things settled down, many of the revolutionaries turned outward and see themselves as a chosen people that should bring their new ideas and way of doing things to the rest of the world. Everything we have talked about regarding the crisis period and the terror can be summed up in 7 points. First, the terror is preceded by episodes of violence during the revolution, such as crackdowns by the extremists, civil wars, or foreign invasions. These previous violent episodes condition both the public and leaders for more violence in the future. Second is the pressure of civil war or foreign invasion. Civil war and foreign invasions, besides making the population more accustomed to violence, also makes the government centralize its power, making it easier to organize the terror. Civil wars and foreign invasions also make the government much more paranoid about anyone criticizing or disagreeing with them. As a result of the increased paranoia, repression of any opposing views becomes more widespread and more brutal. Third is the inexperience in governing and administrating the whole population. As mentioned earlier in this video, the inability to lead and administer the country leads to the use of violence to impose the extremists' ideology on the country. Fourth is the fact that by the time the extremists have taken power, the country will be in a major economic crisis. The economic crisis puts additional pressure on administrators, making them more likely to use violence. Fifth is that the state of class struggle in the country by this point is usually very fraught. The civil war that usually happens after a revolution is caused on the competing interests of various classes. The class struggle may not be between different economic classes. For example, during the French Revolution, the strongest supporters of the revolution were the middle class, the wealthy, and the very wealthy, but they were denied any influence in politics before the revolution. Sixth, the extremists that are in control of the government did not get to where they are by compromising. The extremists in the government believe that their ideas are the only right way to do things, and so will not compromise, making violence more likely between the extremists and those who disagree with them. The impact of each point is different in each revolution. Each point affects how the other points ultimately influence the terror. It is impossible to disentangle exactly how important each point is on how the terror unfolds, and on how severe the terror ultimately becomes. Thermidor was a month on France's revolutionary calendar, and now means the period of time after the terror. Thermidor is a reaction to the terror, with all the fear and uncertainty that period held for so many in society. The persecutions and attempts to enforce the extremists' view of how a society should run are stopped, or at least pulled back a great deal. The Thermidorian reaction is universal to all the revolutions Brinton studied in his book. A universal part of the Thermidorian reaction is the ascension of an authoritarian leader. Just before and during the crisis period, power is centralized into the government. Aspiring authoritarian leaders are able to take advantage of the centralized power to exert tight control over the country. Cromwell, Napoleon, and Stalin are examples of these types of leaders. The new authoritarian leaders don't take total control immediately, but concentrate control for themselves over time. Once the authoritarian leaders do take control, people who were supporters of the moderates or didn't support the revolution at all are often given amnesty and are able to return to normal life. Even royal families that were deposed and people that actively fought against the revolution are often allowed to return to their normal life. For example, the Stuarts were eventually restored in England, and the Bourbons came back for a time in France. The people who survive the terror and start working for or go back to working for government come from different social and education backgrounds, as well as different party affiliations. The thing all these people have in common is the ability to adapt to different situations. This diverse group of people are usually able to get the institutions, laws, and bureaucracy needed for a functioning state up and running in a reasonable amount of time. Once the terror is over, the most fanatical revolutionaries, the true believers that won't change or back down from their beliefs, are purged from the society either by exile or death. The new authoritarian leader often uses the fanatical revolutionaries as convenient scapegoats for the general state of disorganization that the state is in after the terror dies down. After the authoritarian leader gets established and the organs of state are up and running, the leaders of the new government often start to enjoy many of the luxuries that the previous leaders enjoyed. The new leadership's luxuries are often not as luxurious as the royalty that had been overthrown, but the lives of the new leaders were much nicer and comfortable than those of the common people. In fact, after the terror, the economic suffering of the common people is usually worse than it was before the revolution. Despite the increase in economic suffering, there is usually little enthusiasm for more revolution. The enthusiasm many revolutionaries had for spreading the ideals of the revolution, both at home and abroad, is mostly extinguished after the Terror. During the Terror, religion is suppressed, or one religion or church is elevated while the others are suppressed. After the Terror and the Thermidorian reaction is in progress, the religions and churches that were suppressed are able to come back. In England, while Cromwell was the Lord Protector, Papists, Anglicans, and Presbyterians were suppressed, while the independent churches were allowed to practice freely. In France, the Catholic Church was shut down for a while, and in Russia, the Orthodox Church was not allowed to operate. In all three of these cases, the churches were able to come back in some form. In England, after Cromwell's death and the restoration of the Stuarts, the Anglican Church was re-established as the primary church in England, and other Protestant denominations were allowed to practice freely. In France, during the reign of Napoleon, the Catholic Church was made the official church of France once again, but Protestants and Jews now had the same rights as Catholics to practice their religion. In the Soviet Union, under Stalin, the Orthodox Church was allowed to openly operate again, but the Soviet authorities kept a close eye on the church. During the Thermidorian reaction, the vices that the revolutionary government had worked hard to suppress or eliminate come back. After the death of Oliver Cromwell, scandal writers and romantic biographers were back at their craft. In France, after Robespierre was guillotined, dance halls opened up and prostitutes started working again. Men's fashion became more elaborate, while women's fashion started showing more skin. In both England and France, politicians became more brazenly corrupt. In the Soviet Union, the official government policy switched from crushing the old order to promoting the new government as a continuation of Russia's glorious past. The main takeaway of the Thermidorian reaction is that people's habits and cultural beliefs are very hard to change. After the extremists try to change society to make it virtuous, people will fall back into their old ways, whether that means drinking, gambling, and other vices, or going back to their faith. People are not fundamentally changed in just a few months or years. The change to society is still very large, though, with new laws, many new people in the ruling class, and often a few from the old ruling class. There will be new governing institutions and a new balance of power within the government. Often government, after the revolution, is more centralized and efficient at governing. Many of the governments overthrown had many outdated practices still being used after hundreds of years. There are some important similarities between the English, French, and Russian revolutions. First, the economic situation in the countries when the revolution took place was okay overall. The revolutions were started by people who were economically well off, but whose economic situation was becoming less stable or degrading. The revolutionaries revolt in the hope that they can create a better future for themselves. The poorest and most oppressed people in society are not involved in the revolution in the beginning. Second, there are bitter class antagonisms in society before the revolution. The class antagonisms are not just based on economics, although economic antagonism is very common in society before a revolution. Class antagonisms can be between a class of wealthy merchants and an aristocratic class that holds on to all the political power, despite the merchants often being just as wealthy or wealthier than the aristocrats. The class antagonisms could also be between different ethnic groups. There are many ways class antagonisms can manifest in a society, but they will be very tense right before a revolution. Third, before a revolution, there is a transfer of allegiances of the intellectuals. Many, if not a large majority of the intellectuals, no longer believe in the system and actively want something new. Fourth, the government is very inefficient at carrying out its duties and services. This is usually because of changes in technology, business methods, new moneyed classes, newer transportation methods, and other innovations. The government isn't updated, and so is unable to effectively administer a system that is no longer based primarily on a feudal system. Fifth, the ruling class loses faith in its right to rule and in its traditions. Many in the ruling class become empathetic with the plight of the underclasses, and often join the movements to overthrow their own class. Some in the ruling class will ignore the responsibilities of government and become politically inept, making a revolution more likely. In the first stages of the revolution, the ineptness of the administrative state is revealed when the state attempts to use force to crush the revolution. The ineptness of the state's administration is caused primarily by financial problems. The state is often unable to fully finance itself, and so cuts government services or raises taxes, or does both, to make up for the shortfall. The government's attempt to use force ends up failing to stop the revolution. The revolution ends up looking more viable in many people's eyes after it survives the attempt to crush it. The revolution is often able to recruit many new members after surviving the failed use of force against it. Sometimes, government forces even join the revolutionaries. Once the revolutionaries take control of the government, different factions within the revolutionaries, who had been working mostly as a single front against the government, begin a power struggle. Right after the revolutionaries win, the moderate wing of the revolutionary front takes over. The moderates don't want to change the system much. They mainly wanted a change of management, rather than a major change to the system. The refusal of the moderates to do more than make minor tweaks around the edges invites the ire of the rest of the revolutionaries, and many people who supported the revolution. Many people supported the revolution because they thought things were going to get better for themselves and their families. The moderates don't change much, so the situation does not change for supporters of the revolution. The revolutionaries that do want to change the system, i.e. the extremists, are able to use the fact that things aren't getting better for most people to rally support and kick the moderates out. The most important reason the extremists can hold on to power is their focus on creating a strong, centralized government. The extremists are then able to use the concentrated power of the government to enforce rules and regulations. In many revolutions, outside nations pose a threat of invasion, helping justify the extremist focus on centralizing power to strengthen the new government's ability to defend the nation. One of the last points Brinton makes in The Anatomy of Revolution is the fact that he is examining 4 European revolutions from the 17th to the 20th centuries. Because of this limited sample size, it is important to be cautious about applying the lessons learned by examining these particular revolutions to other revolutions in different contexts. I think it can be useful to apply these lessons to other revolutions, but it must be done carefully, taking into account different cultural and historical contexts. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.